Good morning. Wow, that was a phenomenal Hugh Herr talking about augmenting the human body using technology and bionics. Was actually a really, really lovely lead into what I want to talk about. Because what I noticed, and this came across in some of the questions as well, is we don't know how to think about thinking about that kind of change. Okay, we don't have mental models to process that kind of change. Is a man without legs less than a man, more than a man with stuff? It raises a bunch of questions. I'm Daniel Terhorst-North. I've been in technology for about 30 years. For the last probably 10 or 12 of those, I've been looking very much at how organizations work. In fact, in my day job, mostly how organizations don't work. And so what I try and do is help them fail to not work better. I'd love to say I help optimize organizations, but that doesn't happen as often as I'd like. I don't want to talk about me. I want to talk about this gentleman. So this is Eliyahu Goldratt. Who's come across Eliyahu Goldratt at some point in their working life? Fantastic. I get to be the person. Let the record show depressingly few hands went up. Okay. I get to be the person that tells you about Eliyahu Goldratt. Goldratt was one of the great thinkers, I think great management thinkers of the late 20th, early 21st century. He introduced this idea of theory of constraints, which is looking at how work moves through organizations and looking at how we don't really understand how that works and how we make all the wrong decisions on the back of that. In 1984, he wrote a book called The Goal, which was he really struggled to get this book published because it's a novel, it's a storybook that's also a management book. And so he's taking it to publishers and he's saying, look, I've written this management book that's a novel. And they said, great, so does it go into management or under fiction? And he said, yes. And they said, we don't know what to do with this. And anyway, no one will buy it. And then eventually he took it around loads of different publishers and someone published it and it sold millions, tens of millions of copies. One of the largest selling management books in history. And it's about a chap called Alex who works in a factory. And the factory is going down the tubes, and Alex is given 30 days to save the factory, or everyone gets laid off. And Alex meets up with an old school teacher who's a physics teacher. And Goldratt's background is he's a physicist who went into management. And so he has this idea, what he calls fundamental simplicity. These incredibly complicated, messy-looking organizations, there's a bunch of really simple rules underpinning all of that, and if we can understand the rules, and if we can teach each other the rules, we can reason about organizations. And so he writes this book, and it should have changed industry. It should have changed how we do work. And the problem is, we didn't know how to consume that. So this is the early 80s. In about 25 years later, he did a series of lectures called Beyond the Goal, which is everything I've learned in the 25 years since publishing my book, and why no one listens. Okay, and so I listened to Beyond the Goal. So The Goal itself was published, as I say, 1984. About 2 years ago, it came out as a graphic novel. Beyond the Goal is a series of lectures, so they're spoken. So you don't even need to be able to read these two. Okay, there is no excuse not to read these two books, or these two sets of information. So Beyond the Goal, then, Goldratt lays out a series of talks of things he's learned, and I'm listening to these talks, and he said one thing in one of the first talks that blew my mind. It's one of these incredibly simple statements. When you unpack it, there's a huge amount to it, and so that's what I want to share with you this morning. What he says is this. He says, technology can bring benefits if and only if it diminishes a limitation. And then he says, if you agree with that, we're done. Okay, I'm going to go, okay, what does that mean? Technology can bring benefits if and only if it diminishes a limitation. What does that statement mean? Well, let's take a look. Of course, we turn to the dictionary. What does the dictionary say? What is dictionary.com or Merriam-Webster? What is technology? It's the branch of knowledge that deals with creation and use of technical means, practical application of knowledge. The key things in common here are taking knowledge and applying it. So it's not enough to just have abstract thought, abstract knowledge, and it's not enough to apply things blindly. We want to take knowledge and apply knowledge, and that's what we talk about with technology. And what he's saying is this. He's saying we're really, really bad at adopting new technology. Okay? And in fact, even that's probably not true, because we're a bit addicted to technology. We love technology. what we're really, really bad at is benefiting from new technology. So we have this voracious appetite for technology, and we consume all this stuff, and we don't really get the benefits from it. And so then what Goldratt says, he says, the reason we don't benefit from technology is we don't understand how to reason about benefiting from technology. He says there's a series of 4 questions we need to ask ourselves, and we ask ourselves these questions in series, 1, 2, 3, 4, and by going through these questions, we can understand how to leverage a new technology, and the problem is we don't often get past question 1. So I want to share the questions with you, and then what I want to do is take you through a series of examples of technologies from the 70s through to kind of now, and apply these 4 questions to each of those examples in order to sort of pull out a principle, if you like, in order to pull out a conclusion. And then what I'm going to try and do is tie them all up in a little bow and give them to you. So what are our questions then? First question is this. What is the power of this technology? What does it do? This is the easy question to answer because you just read the marketing. Okay? Read the marketing, listen to the salesperson, that's the power of the technology. It does this. Okay? And we go, brilliant, it does this. It's, someone holding up a slightly smaller, slightly squarer phone saying, this changes everything. It doesn't change everything. It's a phone, just like all the other phones, right? It doesn't change everything. What's the power of the technology? The second question we need to ask ourselves then is this. What limitation does the technology diminish? Remember, it brings benefits if and only if it diminishes a limitation. What limitation does this technology diminish? If we can't answer that, we can't answer the question, will I benefit from this technology? Do I have that limitation? Is this thing holding me back? So now I've got a frame of reference for reasoning about whether or not this technology can help me. And that's usually where we stop. I'm going to go and buy this technology, or I'm going to adopt this technology, or whatever it is. The problem is, we were fine. We were absolutely fine before this technology came along. Well, it might not have been fine, but we were alive. We were surviving. We were doing okay. And that means we had a frame, we had a way of thinking, a way of being, in which we were fine without that technology. And the problem is, when we adopt that technology and we don't change that frame, we're basically where we were, but with the technology. And so we need to start asking the question, what rules enable us to cope with that limitation? Okay? So we're currently in a world without bionic limbs. We're currently in a world without, nearly without flying drones. We've got flying drones. That's coming. But most of us live lives without those things, and what rules enable us to cope? Because we need to start challenging some of those rules. We need to start unpacking some of those rules. Otherwise, we're just going to carry on as we were. And the problem with these rules is they're often hiding in plain sight, and that's what I want to try and do with some of these examples, is talk about some of the ways in which they're hiding in plain sight. And then his 4th question, he says, which new rules will we need? And there's 2 parts to this. Which new rules will we need to manage to contain this new technology? And also, which new rules will we need to exploit to maximize the benefit of this technology? If we don't ask these questions, answer these questions in sequence, in order, we will not benefit from any technological innovation. We'll just have it. Okay? So, and I want to pick out this thing. What rules enabled us to cope with this limitation? Which rules enabled us? Because rules that enable us to live with a limitation inevitably constrain us when you remove that limitation. Yeah, there's a technical, the behavioral psychologists call it a limiting belief. There's an experiment that wasn't done, so I'll tell you now, it's an apocryphal experiment that wasn't done with monkeys, but it's used as an example. We have a cage full of monkeys, and you put some bananas in the cage, and every time one of the monkeys goes for a banana, all of the monkeys get hosed with water, cold water. And they learn very quickly that that's a dumb thing to do. And so whenever one of the monkeys goes for the water, all of the other monkeys jump on the monkey and say, don't do that, we're going to get soaked. Okay? And so then what happens is, over time, you take out one of the monkeys and you introduce a new monkey that has never been soaked. And the new monkey goes, bananas, cool. Goes to grab the bananas, and all the other monkeys pounce on it and beat it up, and is like, dude, bananas. And so, and one by one, you take out all the existing monkeys, and you bring in a load of new monkeys, and now you have an entire population of monkeys who have never been sprayed with water, none of whom will touch the banana. Okay? That didn't happen, but it's a great illustration. What did happen, which I think is even better, was there was a waiting room, a set-up waiting room, a doctor's waiting room. And the idea is everyone apart from one person in this waiting room is an actor. And what would happen is a bell would go off, like a ding, and all of these people would stand up. And this one person who's, the victim would like look around and go, what's everyone doing? But they wouldn't like stand up, they'd all, on their phone, they'd stand up, then sit down again, or they're reading a book, and they'd stand up and they'd sit down again. And after this has happened 2 or 3 times, of course, the poor victim stands up. And everyone sits down, they sit down again. And they do this. They do one at a time phase people out until the entire waiting room is full of people who are none of them are actors. And every time the bell goes off, they go, stand up, and they sit down again. We've got this limiting mentality that's the rules, right? So I want to give a couple of examples. These are examples that Eliyahu Goldratt uses in his talk, and then I want to kind of go a bit off-piste and share some others. So the first example he uses, because he was there, he was doing this stuff in the late 70s, early 80s. Who's come across MRP? Any industrial folks here? Okay, it's a couple of hands, yeah. All of the grey, tired-looking people. Yeah, fantastic. So MRP, material requirements planning. You run a factory, you run a manufacturing installation of some sort. One of the most complicated problems you have, one of the biggest problems you have, is how much stuff to order. If you over-order materials, you have sunk cost, and you have carrying cost, it's called, like the cost of having all this stuff in warehouses or storerooms or whatever that you need to maintain. So you don't want to over-order. If you under-order, you have the risk of process starvation. I've got my order books full, but I can't fulfill my orders because I don't have enough materials. And when you get any non-trivial installation, it's really, really hard because any single part, you're at the mercy of the first shortage you have. If I'm building a car and I have one tiny part that I run out of, I can't build cars, even if I've got an abundance of everything else. Okay, so materials resource planning is a big deal. In the 70s, early 80s, you might have a factory with 300-400 people in it. You would have a team of 20 people whose job it was to calculate, to forecast the materials requirements for the next month. And they would do it on a monthly cycle because it took about a week for this team of 20 people to come up with a figure that they were confident about across the entire set of materials, what we should order for the next month. And so you had this monthly rolling model. In the late 70s, DuPont in the US, they introduced one of the first business systems. This is like, first enterprise software, was an MRP system, and this MRP system was magical. It could calculate all of the materials requirements overnight. It was an overnight batch job that would run, and in the morning you had the answer. And because they had this secret weapon, they were able to run much, much leaner factories, much more efficient factories, and they could fulfill orders faster, more dynamically, all of that, and they started taking over the world. And they did very well. And then, word got out, and then people productized these MRP systems, and all these other big manufacturers started taking on MRP systems. And guess what benefit they got? None. But they did spend a lot of money on MRP systems. So if you're an MRP salesperson, you were basically quids in. You were set. So let's unpack this, and let's apply these questions to this world of MRP. What is the power of an MRP system? What power does it give me? The power it gives me is this: I can carry out these complex MRP calculations overnight. It's like magic. 20 people in a room, beavering away for a week, computer overnight. Fantastic. Okay, so what's the limitation then that this diminishes? Well, clearly, the limitation is the entire week it used to take to calculate MRP. So why weren't people able to, why weren't these companies reaping the benefits of this incredibly powerful MRP system? What were the rules that said, this is how we manage the limitation that it takes an entire week to calculate MRP. Well, the rule was this. We plan monthly. We plan monthly because otherwise it's too expensive to calculate. I can't do it in less than a week because it takes a week to do the calculation. If I'm doing it every week, that's really expensive. So I figured the best kind of trade-off of uncertainty versus cost is probably monthly. And so everyone had a monthly cycle of ordering, a monthly cycle of supply chain, monthly cycle of inventory. And so we plan monthly. And so now, okay, well, if I'm going to unthink my monthly planning and start to work differently, what new rules are going to enable me to do this? So, well, instead of monthly, I could, if I can get my MRP calculation overnight, I could do this every week. I could do it twice a week. I could do it 2 or 3 times a week. This would be pretty cool. I could figure out my near-term inventory and my near-term order book 2 or 3 times every 2 or 3 days. Wow, that'd be cool. The problem is, no one I deal with is ready for this. All of my supply chain is used to a monthly order. And suddenly Daniel's on the phone going, yeah, 17 of those. 17? You normally take 200. I know, but guess what? In 2 days' time, I'll be on the phone for another 12. And so what we need to do is we need to re-engage with our suppliers to say we are going to be ordering much smaller quantities much more frequently. So we need to think about transportation and inventory and movement of goods and all this kind of stuff. And for our customers as well, we can now offer that to them as a USP, which is what DuPont did. They said, you don't need to give us these big, expensive, high-risk orders. You can basically, almost on demand, just tell us what we want, and we can promise to fulfill it within 2 days. Normally an order book's like a 6-week lead time, and they're going, we can do this basically tomorrow, which is magic, yeah? But the problem is, number 3, the problem is that we plan monthly. And so when we have these rules, and especially in the corporate world, the enterprise world, what happens is rules become policy. If the policy is we plan monthly, then what was happening, and it was happening across the industry, was everyone once a month would run this overnight process. Right? So they were running these super expensive computers once a month, ordering once a month, and seeing no benefit. And then, of course, what happens, you get the backlash. They blame the technology, they blame the suppliers of the technology, and they say MRP systems are rubbish. Well, they are if you don't change anything else. Second example, ERP. Aha. I've figured the age range of this audience now. Because MRP, people are going, what? ERP, people are going, ha, 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 ha. Oh, I know ERP. Oh, yes. Who are the ERP people? Yeah, let the record show a lot more hands. Enterprise resource planning. Enterprise resource planning, this was the darling of the sort of late 80s, early 90s. This was the first, I know, this was my kind of era. I came into technology in like the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s myself. So I was in enterprise systems around then. And I would see companies spend, it wasn't uncommon to spend tens of millions of dollars rolling out an ERP system. And these ERP systems are all the same kind of shape. You had SAP, you had Barn, you had JD Edwards, they've all consolidated down to about 3 now, but there were many, many, many of these things. And all of them basically had the same story, which is, this is how enterprise resource planning should work. Thud, you better design your organization around it. And people went, oh, okay. And so buying ERP wasn't like, buying Microsoft Office. You would buy an installation or implementation, and an implementation would be an army of consultants swarming all over your organization, new data centers. It was a big deal rolling out ERP. So why would you spend all that money on ERP? What was the power of ERP? What was the thing that ERP gave you? And the thing that ERP gave you, the thing that MRP gave you was calculation. So the first thing we use computers for in big organizations was doing sums, was calculating things. The second big revolution in enterprise systems was data, was being able to, as an organization grows, what happens is it specializes. If the two of us start a company, we both know what's going on, we're on the phone, we're chatting to each other. Once we scale, there might be 20 or 30 of us. We still sort of know what's going on. By the time there's 200 or 300 of us, we're going to have a sales department, a fulfillment department, a research department, and a manufacturing. We've gone into little groups. Now scale that up to thousands, tens of thousands. What you have is these enormous companies, and they're full of fairly smart people, right? No one hires dumb people. That's not a thing. So we've got all these smart people, and all these smart people are doing the best they can. And the best they can is, I can only see this far out. I'm in sales, I can only see my sales figures. I don't know what the inventory levels are in manufacturing because it's on a different site. And anyway, I'll probably find that in the monthly figures, which themselves are trailing monthly, so I'm usually about 6 to 8 weeks out of date on any information outside of my bubble. Given that, I'm going to try and make good choices. And what happens is you then end up with really good local optimizations. And when you add up lots and lots of really good local optimizations, it's basically a disaster. It's how most organizations run. What you don't have is any kind of holistic view. So the power of ERP then, let's apply these questions. The power of ERP is the ability to collect and analyze information across the whole firm. Suddenly, for the first time, I can see where my order processing is, where my stock is, where my fulfillment is, where my sales pipeline funnel is, my marketing. I can see everything that's going on, and I can see a holistic view of my organization. And this is, we just take this for granted now. We're an organization, I want to see the sales figures for, 2 days ago. There they are, right? This was unheard of. And so what's the limitation it diminishes? The limitation it diminishes here is a little bit more subtle. What it diminishes is ignorance. It diminishes my lack of knowledge of what's going on elsewhere. And my lack of knowledge of what's going on elsewhere is what's informing my decision-making now. I'm doing the best I can. Okay? Making a locally optimized decision is better than just random. Okay? It's better than nothing. It's much, much less good than knowing what's going on. Okay? So what rules did we use? What rules do we use in organizations where we just look locally at what's going on? Any accountants in the room? Just checking in. Okay. We use a thing called cost accounting. Every part of my organization, every part of my pipeline is defined as either a cost center or a profit center. The profit center is the bits that take money off people. The cost center is everything else. Okay? So if you're a cost center, your goal as a cost center is to cost less, right? To be more efficient. Can you reduce your operating cost? Your goal as a profit center is to maximize revenue. I can't tell whether you're maximizing profit because I don't know how much things cost because the organization is really big and all these things are very fragmented. And this leads to some really interesting perverse behaviors. There was a Ford plant where the actual manufacturer, the factory floor, was incentivized on productivity. Makes sense, right? The more cars you produce, the bigger your bonus. I know you got really good at producing cars. What they didn't have was any kind of connection between what they were manufacturing and the demand side. They didn't know what people were buying. They didn't know what models people wanted. They didn't know how many units were being shifted. They didn't care, right? That's not their bonus. And so what happens is they produce loads of cars. They only have so much storage for cars at a Ford car plant. So then what happens? You fill up the warehouses, you fill up the garages, and now you go out into fields. And they started putting cars in fields, and they had fields full of cars. What happens when you have fields full of cars? Weather. Weather happens. And so now all these cars are out in the rain, and they're not being sold. And so you had this ridiculous scenario where you're spending eye-watering amounts of money turning inventory into finished vehicles that are atrophying and not being sold. And you're getting a bonus for that. Okay? At the point when the US automotive industry imploded, the heads of the main US car vehicle manufacturers, all went to Washington to plead poverty to the government, and all of them flew in private jets. Every single CEO flew there in their own private jet. At a certain level in Ford, a certain management level, you get given a car, fairly low level. You get given a car, a company car. Brilliant. As you move up the ranks, you then get a driver. You get a chauffeur. What does that mean? That means that the top 4 or 5 levels of this massive automotive company haven't bought a car in 15 years, 20 years, haven't been on the forecourt of a car dealership in 15, 20 years, haven't driven a car in 10 years. These are the people making decisions about cars. Okay? Can you see the flaw in this? But we make cost accounting, we use cost accounting to make these local decisions. Can I reduce cost? Can I increase profit or increase revenue? So what new rules are we going to need? So Goldratt actually proposes this in the goal. He proposes this thing called throughput accounting. Throughput accounting. I'm going to make all of you accountants now. Free accounting class. There are three elements to to throughput accounting. It's incredibly easy. The first is investment. Investment is how much money you spend on stuff. The second is throughput. These are all money numbers. Throughput is how much money you make selling stuff. Operating cost is how much it costs to turn investment into throughput. That's all of it. You're now all qualified throughput accountants. How about that? Okay, I'll be handing out certificates. It's fine. And so then the goal of a healthy organization is I want to minimize investment, maximize throughput, minimize operating cost. But I want to do all three of those simultaneously. If I can get a handle on all three of those, I win. And this is what Goldratt did again and again and again with these organizations, is taught them how to do this. So why didn't ERP take off? Why didn't this work? Well, this is worse than policy, right? Because at some point, rules become law. So if you are a listed company, if you're a publicly traded company, you have to produce cost accounting figures on a quarterly basis, which, again, it stands to reason. Logically, I want to be able to compare apples with apples. If I want to invest in this company or this company, I want to see what their numbers are. And the numbers are a thing called GAAP, Generally Accepted Accounting Principles. And they have these crazy acronyms like EBITDA and stuff like that. Profit before income and tax and things. And all of these are completely insane cost accounting numbers. They're things I can calculate by looking at, it's like taking the Mona Lisa and making a histogram of all the pigment colors and saying, well, clearly that's a good painting because he's got quite a lot of yellow going on there, and yellow's a good... Right? It doesn't make sense, right? Some things are irreducible. The beauty of the Mona Lisa is irreducible. Okay, it's an irreducible system. It's a systemic characteristic. I can't break it down into the pieces and say, well, basically these pieces all make the Mona Lisa. Likewise, the effective flow of value through an organization, generation of value through an organization, is a holistic thing. So I can't break it into pieces, but we do. So because now I have a legal requirement to run my organization like this, I'm completely hamstrung. Because ERP is saying, here's all the information you need to make good choices. And I go, great, but I can't. Or at least I don't know how to because my brain doesn't do that because cost accounting. So, okay, let's bring ourselves into the next decade. So the early 2000s. Agile software development. There's some, hey, Octo people going, ha ha ha, this is me. I recognize this. In the 90s, again, this is my kind of vintage, if you like. Mostly business software, certainly custom business software, was massive, multi-year, heavyweight projects, eye-watering amounts of money, at the end of which you typically got the wrong thing if you got anything at all. Okay, and we called that enterprise software. Go. And a bunch of folks got really frustrated by this at various points, various places in the world, and independently came up with very similar solutions or very similar approaches to doing work that they felt worked better than massive multi-year project plans with Gantt charts. So again, Henry Gantt, right? Henry Gantt was a peer of Henry Ford and Frederick Taylor, this very, very smart guy. And he invents the Gantt chart because he's trying to make sense of huge amounts of moving parts and complexity. It works really well when you have what's called detail complexity. So a jigsaw puzzle, a Lego Death Star, right? That's detail complexity. There's loads and loads of little pieces, but I can break it into small pieces, build them up, build them up, build them up, and get a Death Star, which is cool. And in fact, nowadays, if you buy a Lego Death Star, it comes in little packs. You get little pouches that tell you which pieces to make, and then you plug them all together. That's detail complexity. Dynamic complexity is where you have emergent behavior because of system properties. So the classic exemplar of dynamic complexity is weather. So the whole of weather is wind, water, temperature, pressure. That's basically it. You can model all weather with wind, water, temperature, pressure, and a little bit of geography, but basically those four things. What you can't do is know when a gust of wind is going to blow. You can't know that because the system itself is a feedback system. As the system operates, it changes itself. And so the problem we have is we try to apply detailed thinking to dynamic systems, and the wheels fall off. So we try to apply Gantt chart type reductionism to complex adaptive systems of human behavior, like work, and it blows up. So agile software development then is a bunch of folks saying, well, look, if we just worked in much smaller batches, if we did smaller things more frequently, spoke to each other, crazy human interaction, stuff like that, better work might happen. We might get better outcomes. And they all had different names for this. They had names like Scrum and Crystal and XP and DSDM and Adaptive. And anyway, a bunch of them got together in 2001 in a ski cabin in Utah. And they hung out for the weekend and drank whiskey, true story. And at the end of which, they had this thing called the Agile Manifesto, which was, although we were all doing these things differently, there's a load of things we've got in common. So that's agile development. So so if we take this as a technology, what happens when we apply these 4 questions to agile software development? What's the power of software of agile? What's the power of agile? What I hear again and again is better, faster, cheaper. Better, faster, cheaper delivery of business impact. And I specifically don't talk about software. Software is a means to an end. What I want to do is move an organization, is impact a business. Better, because I'm working in small batches and I'm getting feedback so I can course correct much more frequently. Faster, because I'm working in small batches. Those small batches fly through the system much more frequently. It's not unusual to have releases every few weeks in a large organization or even every few days. When you get to kind of Facebook or Google scale, you're doing thousands of software releases a day. Right? Whoa. Right? Rather than one every 2.5 years. Yeah? Thousands per day. Okay? A bunch of folks' brains don't know how to process that. So what limitation does this diminish? Well, the limitation it diminishes is inflexibility. Okay, it diminishes the limitation that we set our course, we set our 2-3 year plan, and that plan is set in stone. We have heavyweight processes around that, which is enormous cost and enormous. There's a finance term called value at risk. So value at risk is how much money you've poured into something without getting anything back. So if I'm doing very small, frequent releases of anything, if I'm doing anything iteratively, I invest a bit and get something back, invest a bit and get something back. So I'm spending money, but I'm getting some return. My value at risk at any point in time is fairly small. With a large-scale development of anything, I put more and more and more and more money. I haven't actually released anything yet. In the UK, the kind of the zenith of this was a thing called NHS for IT. It's a healthcare project in the last decade. 12 billion pounds. Okay? So on current Brexit exchange rates, that's about 27 euros. But 12 billion pounds. The government spent 12 billion pounds. Government doesn't have money. I spent 12 billion pounds. Me and every other taxpayer in the UK spent 12 billion pounds on, drumroll, nothing. Right? Nothing ever went live from NHS for IT. Nothing. But an awful lot of very large companies, thanks very much for your 12 billion pounds. And so the government decided that wasn't going to happen again, and they introduced a thing called GDS, Government Digital Services, a few years ago, which is now a much smaller, much leaner way of building government services. And it's doing okay. So what rules then enabled us to live in a world without agile development? How did we cope before we could do things in small, rapid, iterative chunks? Well, the main thing that we thought, the main rule that we had, was that we require extensive sequential planning, because I need to figure out who and when and what, my Gantt chart, analysis, because all of the detail has to be right, because the cost of it being wrong is prohibitive, design, because if I don't get the software architecture correct, I can't break it down into small modules and give it to teams. Detailed specification, turn this specification into code. That's your job. You type until the specification is turned into code. And of course, because we know this doesn't work, huge amounts of testing at the end. Okay? And these are the rules that we govern, that we deliver software by. And we believe we need this because that's how you manage risk. Okay. And so what new rules are we going to need? Well, the new rules, it turns out, are surprisingly human. We want close collaboration, frequent releases, customer feedback, all that kind of stuff. So that's great, but what does this tell us? Well, as well as rules becoming policy, rules becoming law, what happens then is rules become structure. So the shape of my organization is predicated on those rules that enabled me to cope. I have planning teams and analysis teams and design teams and testing teams, and that's how my organization is set up. When I then try to introduce agile development methods into an organization that shape, if I'm not prepared to challenge the shape of that organization, I just spend a load of money on consultants and certification. And we're agile. And so we have this idea of a sprint, which comes from Scrum. And a sprint is typically a little time box. And so rather than a sprint being a period of time in which I build software, a sprint, you have a design sprint, and then a testing sprint, and then a hardening sprint. You basically just time-sliced this big heavyweight process, and we're calling it Agile. It's completely insane. So, next example, cloud. Just for anyone who puts talks together, finding a word cloud, is really hard. Okay, Googling for a word cloud with cloud. So, okay, cloud computing, it's about 12 years. You know, we've gotten quite good at this now. It's been around for a while. When this first came out, again, really mind-blowing and mind-expanding. What does it mean? What is the power of the cloud? What does it allow us to do? Well, cloud is basically utility computing, right? It gives us on-demand compute power. That's a new thing. We've never had on-demand compute power before. What limitation does that diminish? Well, clearly the cost and risk of running your own data center. Like, having a data center is a big investment. Filling it with machines. Those machines are immediately out of date. As soon as you order them, they're out of date, and they're becoming more and more out of date as Moore's law and Intel's product roadmap makes them more and more redundant. So I have this cost and risk associated with running my own data center. Well, we've been running our own data centers for decades. So what rules enable us to do that? Well, we believe this. We believe hardware procurement and management is big and expensive and complicated. And because it's big and expensive and complicated, it requires lots of governance and heavyweight stuff. Okay? And so we need to start unthinking that. And what will happen, I worked in organizations where the procurement process for getting a VM, getting a virtual machine, is the same as the procurement process for buying hardware. So getting a VM, I should be able to just log in somewhere and go, give me a VM. It's done. No, it needs to be signed off by 3 levels of management. It takes 12 weeks to get a virtual machine in this particular bank, which will remain unnamed. Okay? What new rules am I going to need then? Well, the new rules are really counterintuitive if you come from that world. The new rules are the idea that I can explore technology ideas quickly and inexpensively. The first .com boom, the noughties, the late 90s, early zeros, if you wanted to be a tech startup then, you needed a ton of investment and data centers and tin. Now, if you want to be a startup, you just need an AWS account, right? You need to be able to get onto Azure and type things in. That's it. You know, you are running massive farms of things for a few dollars a month. It's completely insane. The economics has changed. You can reduce computing power. That's completely unintuitive. I can dial down my data center, right? And we don't know how to think about that. And because we don't know how to think about that, the rules become culture. We have a culture of hardware being big and expensive and complicated, and a culture of heavy governance. And that culture is, we have to unpack that culture before we can even start making sense of cloud. And moving to cloud is not a technology play, it's a culture play. Right? The technology bit is relatively straightforward. It's moving stuff on a computer onto stuff on a computer. Honestly, it's really not rocket science. The hard bit is how we reason about it. The last example I want to give you then, and it kind of ties into the theme of the conference, I think, a little, is sustainable energy. So sustainable energy, again, is a technology. Okay? It's knowledge applied to a situation we have. So clearly, I'm going to suggest everyone in this room, everyone at this conference, is aware that there is a real and pressing urgency, necessity, dire, literally existential crisis going on here, and yet we all drive around in our cars. Right? We all turn on our lights at home knowing that electricity is coming from a bunch of oil and coal and fossil fuels that are being burnt, and we all go, just to pretend it's not happening. My carbon footprint, I mean, look, there's huge factories over there. I'm a rounding error, honestly. But then if you add up lots and lots and lots of rounding errors, bad things happen. So what is the power then? What is the power of sustainable energy? The power of sustainable energy is power. Power is the power of sustainable energy. It's the ability to produce renewable energy economically and reliably. We've never had those two things before. It was either uneconomical because we were trying to design our way through it. It was really, really hard to get reliable. You see some of these, particularly Denmark's full of them, and France actually has a bunch as well. These enormous wind towers, wind generators. They have these huge, huge, huge fins on them. And these things are spinning pretty fast, right? When there's a wind up, they're going pretty fast and they're rotating. The actual engineering required to have that not fall off and kill people is quite high, right? The requirement for that to be secure is quite big. We've gotten good at that, which brings the economics down. Reliability, one of the big kind of counter-arguments to sustainable energy, particularly wind and water, tidal energy, is that it's not reliable. Right, is that wind, in the UK, one of the big arguments has been, well, in the winter, which is when we need all this energy, you actually get measurably lower wind than the rest of the year. And it's bumpy. We don't know when it's going to be windy. I refer you to my earlier weather observation. But that's okay because now we have storage, electric storage, massive lithium-ion batteries that can store whatever power we generate and then release it as needed. Okay, we've never had that before, certainly not with any degree of economics. And these things have minimal impact on the environment. Brilliant, right? So what is the limitation that diminishes? Again, no great surprises. The dependence on climate-damaging source of energy and, like a little bit political, the dependence on the organizations and the states that control them. If you took a bunch of Middle East states and you took away the value of the raw material they have under the ground, then take a look at the relationship other countries would have with those states. How tolerant they would then be of human rights violations, say. Okay? How much we wouldn't talk about that while we're busy selling them arms, that kind of thing. Trying to keep them sweet. So what are the rules that have enabled us to get this far without without sustainable energy? Well, basically, we need to assume this. We need to assume the only economical viable sources of energy are fossil fuels and nuclear power. And interestingly, I'll just mention quickly, environmentally damaging. Nuclear power can be clean, there's a thing called thorium. Thorium is far more abundant than uranium, and thorium is non-fissile. If you take a bunch of thorium and whack another bunch of thorium on it, you just get a bigger lump of thorium. Okay? That's how dangerous it is. Right? It only emits energy when you fire neutrons at it. So you put it in a thing and fire neutrons at it, and when you want to turn it off, you stop firing neutrons at it. Right? It cannot do a Chernobyl. Right? That's not a thing. Why don't we use that for nukes then? Because the states that build nuclear power plants want to be able to weaponize them if they need to. That's why. So we make them with uranium, which is incredibly dangerous, much less abundant, much more expensive, etc. So we could build relatively safe nukes. We don't. So what new rules will enable us to exploit this technology? Well, research and investment. Research and investment will make it easier and cheaper, moving from genesis to commodity. These are Simon Wardley terms. If you look at Wardley maps, genesis is making it up, commodity is everyone has it. Okay, so research and investment in sustainable energy will only make it easier and cheaper. But the problem is this. At this stage, rules become paradigm. They become how we reason about the world, how we think. And as soon as they are a paradigm, we are stuck. We are stuck in a mental model that says this is true. Okay? 2 quick examples of breaking the paradigm. I'm running out of time here, but I really want to share these with you. One, I watched this unfold in real time a couple of years ago on Twitter. Was South Australia, SA here. South Australia was having blackouts, power blackouts, because it had really, really choppy electricity generation. And Elon Musk's cousin, Lyndon, who runs Tesla, or runs the battery part of Tesla, said, on Twitter, he said, hey, we could solve that. we could solve that. We could solve that in 100 days. I bet you we could solve that in 100 days. And so Mike Cannon-Brooks, who I know this guy, I've known him for many years. Mike Cannon-Brooks, a lovely Australian guy, founded Atlassian Software, product company, and he became a billionaire a couple of years ago, floated the company. Lovely, grounded individual, said, I'll take that bet. I said, what? So on Twitter, in real time, Mike Cannon-Brooks says, Lyndon and Elon Musk, how serious are you about this bet? If I can make the dollars happen, can you guarantee 100 megawatts of storage in 100 days? Elon Musk jumps on the chat and says, yes. I'll get the system installed and work in 100 days from contract, or it's free. Is that serious enough for you? Apparently that's how billionaires do business. They just duke it out on Twitter. Anyway, this happened. The following November, Mike Cannon-Brooks says, it's the best I've ever felt about losing a bet. And so now 100 megawatts of storage is now available and live in South Australia in massive lithium-ion stores. A more recent example, this young lady, causing all kinds of mischief. I really like her. So you can break the paradigm, but you've got to unthink things. Okay, so the problem we've got is this: the rules are holding us back. The rules are holding us back, and so what we need to do is break the rules. And it turns out the way we break the rules is deceptively simple. We just go through each of Eliyahu Goldratt's questions, and we turn them into a statement, and we figure out what that statement means. The first thing we do is we want to understand the power of the new technology. So what does it do? How does it work? How can we exploit it? Right, let's get personal about this. Rather than, oh, here's this thing and it does this. What does it do for me? What can I get out of this technology? Once I understand the power of the technology, I ask myself, what limitations will the technology diminish? How can I prove that the limitation's holding me back? Is it just a desire as an Apple fanboy or fangirl to go and get the latest thing? Or do I genuinely have a need which will be met, a limitation which will be diminished by adopting this technology? And also, how would I measure it? Right? If you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. Then I want to understand the existing rules we use to manage the limitation. This is hard. It's hard because the rules are usually hiding in plain sight. Okay, we're usually rubbish at this. So we want to identify the rules we use to manage the limitation. How are they going to get in the way? And it may be that we need to change the law. We need to change the regulatory framework in order to move these things forward. Hugh Ho was talking about what are some of the ethical implications of bionic humans. Right? We need to start unpacking some of those questions because they're going to get real very soon. And from a human perspective, and again, I work in organizations applying these sorts of ideas, how do I make it safe to change? Many people are threatened by breaking down the status quo, by breaking down the set of rules, because maybe they've built their career around being really good at those rules. And maybe they have a latent fear that their identity is wrapped up in those rules rather than being good at stuff, and the stuff happens to be those rules. They could get good at some new rules, and that'd be fine, right? A lot of people, their identity is wrapped up in that thing, and they find that very threatening, very challenging. And so how can we create a graceful exit? How can we make it so that you can stop doing that thing or move to a different thing in a way that won't threaten you? Because if I can offer you an exit in a way that doesn't threaten you, you might take that. Okay, otherwise you're just going to double down. And finally, how do we identify and implement the new rules? How do we make that? How do we institutionalize that? Okay, how do we introduce it? And again, there's two levels to this. The first is how do we safely adopt this thing so things don't blow up? Okay, so now we're back at status quo, but with the new thing. Now, how do we exploit it? What new things do we bring? And there's typically an adoption curve that goes with that. So, bringing this all around. Technology can bring benefits then if and only if it diminishes a limitation. So my request to you today, my call to action to you today is this: go break some rules. Thank you.